Good evening and welcome to Coloradan Conversations. I'm Maria Kuntz, the editor of the award-winning Coloradan Alumni Magazine, which hopefully all of you have received. We're really excited to be hosting this event tonight with some incredible CU experts and researchers. And we understand the work and energy it takes to get here, in person, online, to carve out time to engage in something that's piqued your curiosity and to do that in community. So for our virtual audience, I would like to mention that this event is being closed captioned, and if you'd like to access the captions, please click on the CC button located, I think it's the lower right-hand side of the toolbar in your Zoom window. So tonight we'll be discussing how a number of topics have become politicized, specifically how marketing, race, gender, and power play a role in the politicization of brands, social movements, and reproductive rights, and how these factors influence our political ecosystem and how we experience politics in this country. Before going any further, I want to take a moment to read the CU Boulder Land Acknowledgement, and I invite you to follow along with it on the screen. While celebrating CU research, we choose to acknowledge the space we occupy and the land upon which we study, work, and research. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. If you would like to help uplift Indigenous and Native American voices, please consider giving to the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies, also known as CNICE, as a way to create opportunities for Native American students and educators alike. So whether you're new to Coloradan Conversations or you've attended all of them for the past 2 years, I think this is our 7th event, I'd like to share a little about the Coloradan Alumni Magazine and how these events came to be. So 3 times a year, we send the Coloradan Magazine to over 300,000 Forever Buffs and community members. Actually, we send it to 186,000, but we email it to about 155,000, so we try to reach all 300,000 alums. And in return, you call us and you send us incredible letters and emails. I get handwritten letters, I get emails, we get phone calls, and you're sharing memories with us about your experience on campus. You tell us about reconnecting with classmates. And you're celebrating with Forever Buffs, like, I know that person, and oh, that was incredible to read about them. But you've also been engaging about some of the challenging topics that we cover in the magazine. In fact, I email with quite a few alums, and this recent issue's garnered some conversation. So I had a number of emails, and I'm happy to say he registered. Alum Bruce Forshey registered virtually. So Bruce, if you're here, thanks for joining. I saw you registered. We had a number of really, really powerful back and forth emails and conversations about the issue and the topic. And so I invited him and said, hey, we have these events if you want to talk about it more, and we'd love to have you. So thank you all for being here. So that's the reason we decided to create these conversations and gather this Forever Buffs community to stir intellectual curiosity, to build a foundation for taking action and taking things beyond the page and the written word. In the team of people who contribute to the magazine, which is really big, we believe that powerful conversations coupled with knowledge and action can fuel change. So thank you for joining us tonight for this conversation. Tonight's conversation in the fall issue tonight's conversation is inspired by stories from the spring issue, and hopefully you all received your copies in the mail. If not, there are copies in the lobby out front. So for a little context, in the US, there's ample discussion about a dominant two-party system, and there have long been differences, and these parties have morphed and shifted priorities over not just years, but decades and centuries. Most recently, and according to the Pew Research Center, since January 2021, the gap between political parties has grown even wider. We tried in our recent issue to center the question, how have things become so political? What factors and influences exist that amplify the divides we feel as citizens, friends, family, and community members? And I recognize we're talking about a dominant narrative of a two-party system, and we know there are a lot of other parties and that people don't always align with the party, and we're trying to take the conversation beyond party affiliation, but while recognizing that that is a really dominant framework and sort of lens through which we discuss politics in this country. We're also curious about how people can discuss topics where they have significant disagreements. Chancellor DeStefano has been leading conversations about civic engagement throughout this academic year, and we wanted to support that conversation and dive into the research that could help us understand the challenges more deeply. So I'm excited to have so many people with us here in person and online, and to listen and engage with our faculty experts and discuss the questions that arise tonight, or maybe you were wondering before you got here today. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to note that there are some complimentary exhibits during the in-person reception. In the lobby, you'll have the opportunity to meet with researchers from the Leroy Keller Center for the Study of the First Amendment. There's also a great infographic about the First Amendment in the spring issue. And you'll also get to meet with the folks behind the Free Mind podcast hosted by Dr. Matthew Burgess, who was featured in the most recent issue as another person who was interviewed for this story. And with that, our first speaker is Dr. Celeste Montoya. Celeste Montoya is an associate professor of women and gender studies and the faculty director for the Miramontes Arts and Sciences Program, or MASP. She holds a PhD in political science, and her research primarily focuses on the ways in which women and racialized communities mobilize to enact change, with a particular focus on Latinas and other women of color. She has published on social movements, gender violence, voting rights, and political representation. She's currently working on a project exploring Latina political leadership and activism in Colorado. Please welcome to the stage Professor Celeste Montoya.
Good evening. Just testing. Everybody can hear me? All right. So it may come as no surprise to you, in fact, we just talked about it, that party polarization in the US is at an all-time high. A March 2022 study by the Pew Research Center found that Republicans and Democrats in Congress are further apart ideologically today than at any time in the past 50 years. However, the contemporary patterns of polarization have roots that extend back to that time period and beyond. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little about how a key part of this polarization has had to do with how parties have chosen to address the issues of race and gender made salient by the social movements of that time and in the current moment. But first, a little bit of a context and a civics reminder of democracy. So democracy, as you all know, is a system of governance by the people. Most contemporary democracies are representative democracies, elect public officials to represent them. Elections, thus, are an important part of accountability. Parties play an organizing role in this system. Given the diverse array of experience and interests, And in election, there's two parties. The national party structures help to form coalitions in the electorate so they can win elections, and in the institutions so that they can pass legislation some of the time. Social movements are also an important part of democracy. When they are being represented by those in office, they can mobilize outside of institutions in an effort to get their voices heard. Social movements have played an important role in our democracy, both in terms of who gets to participate, as well as efforts to make sure that they're expanding the right to vote to women and to people of color took concerted mobilization. Parties played an important role in this, and in a way that's a little bit different than the current partisan positions. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, as it is still sometimes referred to today, established the post-Civil War amendments that gave African Americans full formal citizenship, including the right to vote. The mostly Southern Democrats at that time opposed these efforts, and afterwards established the Jim Crow laws that continued discrimination for several decades afterwards. Perhaps not surprisingly, many African Americans in the late 1800s and early 1900s were Republicans. This started to change with the FDR's New Deal after the Great Depression, with policies that were meant to address income inequality. But it didn't entirely change or cause a realignment, because some, and many, in fact, of the New Deal policies included discriminatory practices, such as redlining. Republicans were also initially more supportive of giving women the right to vote. And in putting ERA, they were the first to put the Equal Rights Amendment onto their party platforms. Although, eventually, the 19th Amendment ended up passing with bipartisan support, and both parties made an effort to appeal to the women who were entering the electorate. For the first half of the 1900s, neither party did a particularly good job of addressing racial or gendered concerns. It took the social movements of the 1960s to get issues of racial and gender equality back on the political agenda. Most of the social movement organizing prior had been the labor movement, and relatedly, class was one of the most salient issues that caused the partisan divide. Initially, both national parties started to respond to the demands of the social movements, both providing support for civil rights and for women's rights. However, as is often the case with social movements that challenge traditional gender hierarchies or hierarchies in general, they also provoked backlash and counter-mobilization. Here, parties started to make strategic decisions about which side they were going to go with, where they might have the electoral advantage. So as the National Democratic Party started to take a more proactive position on civil rights and on women's rights, the Republicans saw an opportunity to break the Democratic stronghold over the South. In the 1970s, you start to see both parties putting issues of gender and race on their party platforms where previously there had been none. But they start to do it in a different way. For race, we see the Democrats talking more in terms of feminists and women's rights. And for Republicans, we start hearing more traditional gender values and traditional familial roles being played. We start seeing differences also in terms of how they approached racial issues and civil rights. Here we see the Republicans taking a more socially conservative position, but with different justifications, appealing to a new coalition they were building. To libertarians, this framing was about states' rights, about the role of small government, about being economically conservative. There were also Republicans that were more actively and explicitly socially conservative on both gender and race. With the rise of the religious right in the 1980s, social conservatives start taking a more predominant role in the coalition. You can start to see some significant differences in the parties in their platforms during that time period. You also start to see differences in the party and the electorate. So not just looking at what was written on the platform, but how people are responding to that. In the 1980s, we see the gender gap emerging. Now we hear it referred to more commonly in a lot of elections, but really the modern gender gap appears in 1980s. Prior to that, there was a traditional gender gap in which women were more likely to be socially conservative and to vote more in favor of Republicans. But we see that starting to switch. Whoops, wrong button. We see that starting to switch right there around 1984. And at that time, we see a more consistent gap emerging, although it kind of differs. You can see a little bit more fluctuation in terms of how the men are voting during that time period. There is also a significant racial gap. And in fact, that racial gap is significantly bigger than we see in terms of the gender gap. And you can see some of the big differences between how white voters are voting, and this is support for the Democratic candidate, and how Black, Latino, and Asian Americans are voting. And so they only start kind of collecting some of that data for Asian Americans more recently. One of the things that's really interesting and a little bit beyond the scope of the discussion in my presentation, but we can address in the Q&A, is the fact that if you look at it intersectionally, when you start to look at how race plays a role within the gender gap, we see that the modern gender gap is actually driven more by race than it is per se by gender, with white women tending to vote a little bit more conservatively than we see Latinas and African American women. Part of the reason we see the modern gender gap emerging is that both of those groups start to participate in higher numbers after the Civil Rights, after the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1964, first giving African Americans more access to the ballot, and later again with its renewal in the 1970s, which emphasized more Latino rights. So now we get to the current political moment. In the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen some important mass mobilizations, attempting to put some important issues back on the table when people felt the parties were failing to respond to them. The immigrants' rights movement started in the 2005, around 2005, as Congress failed to pass meaningful legislation about immigration reform. Occupy Wall Street put class politics back on the table as income inequality began to grow. The Black Lives Matter movement started discussing lingering racial inequality. The Me Too movement and the Women's March put issues of gender violence that remain persistent back on the table. There's also marriage equality and trans rights. There has also been mobilization in the opposite direction of that. And that's important to remember too. We have some pictures up here of the anti-critical race movement, the anti-trans movement as well. And it may look, now as we have these issues that are made salient again, that the parties are doubling down on the same positions they took in the last wave of mobilization. However, I would argue that it's a lot more than that. And we see internal conflict within both of these parties about how they're going to address the issues, to what extent they're going to address the issues, what strategies they're going to take. Complicating the matter is shifting demographics, partisan affiliations. Are more racially diverse. They're also more diverse in terms of gender identity and sexuality. And they're less likely to affiliate with either party. So there are party trends that people were leaving the Republican Party in terms of affiliation first, but that pattern is now following for the Democratic Party as well. This has been putting pressure on both parties to mobilize, in cases demobilize the population. One of the things we're going to touch on a little bit today and can talk about more in the Q&A are the efforts we see across states, with some states working to increase more people, get more people to the polls, and some states passing more restrictive legislation in an effort to demobilize populations. We're at a pivotal point in our democracy, and what happens next is not yet written in stone. And that we're still allowed to talk about some of these issues here at CU Boulder, a right we shouldn't take for granted in places where it is being outlawed elsewhere, makes it all the more important that we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. Our next speaker is Professor Doug Spencer. Doug is the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Research and Professor of Law at the University of Colorado. Professor Spencer is an election law scholar whose research examines the role of prejudice and racial attitudes in voting, and the ways that election rules and political campaigns contribute to growing inequality in America. Professor Spencer holds a PhD in jurisprudence and social policy from the University of California, Berkeley. He graduated magna cum laude from Columbia University in 2004 with a BA in philosophy. Welcome, Dr. Doug Spencer.
Thank you. All right, as was just announced to you, my research area is in voting rights and election law, and I think we're going to talk a lot more about that when we get to this discussion section over here in a minute. But for my few minutes up front today, I just wanted to have a few comments about a very simple idea, and that is the relationship between political parties, political polarization, and the incentive structures of American politics. And I think there's a lesson to be learned, perhaps, from a simplified idea about how corporations work in the United States. Now, the story that I want to tell begins in 1990. A man named Harvey Gantt is running for the United States Senate in North Carolina. Harvey Gantt is an African-American man. He was the first black student to enroll at Clemson University in the 60s. He had just completed 2 terms as the first black mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, and he's running for Senate. Now, Harvey Gantt was running against the incumbent senator, Jesse Helms. Jesse Helms was a controversial figure. This is a United States senator who said that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were 2 of the most destructive and dangerous pieces of legislation ever enacted in the history of the United States. Later, before he retired from the United States Senate, he entered an elevator in the Senate office building and saw the very first African-American female senator, Carol Moseley Brown from Illinois, standing in the elevator next to him, and started singing, "I Wish I Was in the Land of Cotton," to her face. So this is a controversial figure. A high-stakes election is how it was pitched to voters. Jesse Helms was deeply unpopular with black voters. And in North Carolina, there was a political organizer by the name of Dolores Jordan. And she supported Harvey Gantt, and she was campaigning for Harvey Gantt. And she had an idea that she thought could help Harvey Gantt win the election against Jesse Helms, and that was to get her son, Michael, to publicly endorse Harvey Gantt's campaign. Now, her son, Michael Jordan, was a basketball player for the Chicago Bulls. He didn't live in North Carolina anymore. He lived in Chicago, and he declined to make a public statement in favor of Harvey Gantt. His claim is that I didn't know the man. Why was I going to make a public statement? He got a lot of grief when this became public that his mom was begging him for political endorsement, and his teammates were asking him, "Are you going to be a big politician and a big social justice warrior now?" And Michael Jordan responded to them and said, "No, Republicans buy sneakers too." Now, Michael Jordan at the time had never won a national championship. He wasn't the player that we know he is now. He wasn't the greatest of all time. He was a popular player, but he was a special new breed of athlete who was learning how to brand and endorse products at a level that had never been seen before. I have not seen this movie, but there's a movie out in theaters now called Air that shows how Michael Jordan took a small fledgling shoe company and made it a giant corporate behemoth, Nike. Now, Michael Jordan has faced some criticism in recent years from social activists. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, another NBA player who's much more politically active, said that Michael Jordan chose commerce over conscience, and he's going to have to live with that for the rest of his life. But by and large, the logic of what Michael Jordan was expressing is and should be familiar to us in terms of how to operate a successful business. And that is, don't go alienating half of your potential customers when the purpose of your organization is to maximize your appeal to the broadest number of people possible, to build brand loyalty using customer service, and an appeal towards positive values and positive emotions the way that we're used to in corporate advertising as opposed to political advertising. We see this logic among corporations even in the modern times. Hesitancy to engage in social political causes. In 2021, the state of Georgia passed Senate Bill 202. It restricted voting access in the state. And by and large, corporations remained silent. In Florida, a few years ago, the state legislature passed a bill, an anti-LGBT bill in parts. Disney remained silent about it. But there's something different about corporations in 2021 than in 1990. A recent public opinion poll from Edelman, which is a public relations firm that routinely surveys people about the role of business in politics, found that 86% of respondents expect corporate leaders to publicly engage on major societal issues. And so there's pressure against corporations to make statements and to forego this logic. And corporations were hesitant to do so, but ultimately felt obligated to do so. Coca-Cola made a statement against SB 202 in Georgia. Delta made a statement, even though Republicans fly Delta. Disney finally made a statement against the legislation in Florida. And as predicted, backlash ensued, and there was alienation of a large swath of people who might drink Coca-Cola or visit Disney. And the question is, what's changed? What's different now in 2023 than in 1990 when we see this? This is something that Professor Montoya just talked about, and that is this growing polarization. And why is that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. And scholars are still exploring all of the potential reasons and causes and results. But I think political parties have a big role to play in this story. Political parties have similar incentives to corporations. They should also, and they do have an incentive to appeal to the broadest number of people in society so that they can win elections. But unlike corporations, political parties, as long as they get 50% plus one of whoever happens to show up on election day, they get all the power and all the money. And so they have countervailing incentives to manipulate who shows up to vote and to exert as much effort deciding who votes as they do persuading people of their positions. They also have an incentive to mobilize their supporters only and to find ways to exclude others from voting and to ensure that their own supporters don't defect. And they've become very effective at this, preying on human psychology and helping us learn the joy that we feel when others who aren't like us suffer. Owning the libs, Trump derangement syndrome. Our whole identity is baked into the sadness that we hope others will feel. And political parties have learned that that's a winning strategy. This is democracy on the low road. It's not the ideal democracy. And this is what we see today, premised in part by a lot of things: access to data, better understanding of the electorate, better understanding of human psychology, and then rewards by voters selecting candidates who believe in those strategies. This has generally been as much top-down from parties to us as it has been from us to political parties and campaigns. We see this polarization emerge first among elites, party leaders, elected officials, and then among voters. We see the gap among elites as broader and more pronounced than among mass voters. The effects of this polarization on us are real and lead us to some interesting, maybe detrimental consequences. Here's an example. Here's an app you can put on your phone. You scan a barcode on any product in the grocery store while you're shopping, and you can instantly learn, did the company that made this can of beans support causes that I believe in or not? And if they don't, I'm going to stick it back on the shelf. The people who created this app, they think it's wonderful. Their tagline is, you can only vote once every 4 years, but with our app, you can vote every day. Here's a different app called Boycott. This is a screenshot from my phone. I took a picture of a UPC on a Diet Coke can, and the app tells me that the CEO to median worker pay ratio is 460, which is flagged as problematic. It tells me that Coca-Cola pollutes the water supplies in India and Mexico, but that they support improving legal immigration and visa programs for migrant workers. And so then I can make an educated decision about, am I drinking the right beverage? Do they support my social causes? And for some, this is seen as amazing and an ability for us to have our voice heard in politics. For me, I think this is terrible, just honestly. I think that what we're seeing is ultimately the consumer's decisions to engage in behavior like this is leading to the polarization among corporations in terms of who they serve and how they serve them. And the simple point that I want to make today, and I hope it's not too provocative, and I suspect people will disagree with me, and that is watching corporations become more political, to me, is backwards from where we need to be going as a country. I would prefer for political parties to look more like corporations in the following sense. Political parties should build brand loyalty using customer service, using positive values. It doesn't make sense for Coke to tell me that Pepsi is poisoned, but that's what happens in politics. We need parties to maximize their value to everybody and not just to their current customers. That's the diagnosis that I want to put on the table. How we get there is another interesting question I think should be saved for a longer conversation, which we're going to have, I think, in a few minutes. But that's what I just want to put on the table as part of my comments, so thank you very much for having me today.
All right, thank you, Professor Spencer. And finally, we have Dr. Jennifer Hendricks, who's a professor here at CU Law School. Her research interests include sex equality and sex differences, constitutional family law, equality in sports, and relational feminist theory. Her book on pregnancy and parental rights, Essentially a Mother, a Feminist Approach to the Law of Pregnancy and Motherhood, is coming out from the University of California Press this spring. And I believe I saw a pre-copy at the registration table, so if you're interested and you're here in person, you can take a look at that, otherwise Google it. And welcome, Professor Hendricks.
Thanks, everyone, and good evening. I'm here mostly to talk about the politicization of women's reproduction. Oh, I was going to take this off. In the history of the United States. In US history, Black women's reproduction was notably politicized after the Prohibition of 1808. That was the year in which Congress prohibited further imports of enslaved people into the United States. In response, the slave states turned rape, forced childbearing, and family separation into a breeding program that became the foundation for the political economy of the South and the nation. Indigenous women's reproduction was notably politicized in the late 1800s when the US government adopted the policy, kill the Indian to save the man. At the time, Indian people, unlike Black people, were considered by white people to be capable of becoming white if only they could be stripped of their culture. Kill the Indian to save the man. This was to be accomplished by mass kidnappings of Native children who were taken to so-called boarding schools and indoctrinated in Christianity, not allowed to speak their family languages, and often horrifically abused in other ways. White women's reproduction was politicized through the institution of European marriage that the colonists brought with them, but abortion in particular was notably politicized in the late 1800s. Before then, people thought of abortion mainly as an act of desperation by an unmarried pregnant woman. They did not approve of how she got pregnant, especially, but it wasn't a political crisis. Abortion triggered a political reform movement when white married women, inspired by the women's rights movement that symbolically began in Seneca Falls in 1848, began to use abortion as a way to control their bodies and their reproduction. This was a rebellion against husbands and against women's duty to the state to produce white babies in order to fulfill manifest destiny. It was also a time of white racial panic over immigration and over the sort of brief period of relative freedom that Black people enjoyed shortly after the Civil War, before the Jim Crow crackdown really began. Based on this mix of backlash to Black civil rights movement, plus some kind of outrageous scientific claims about pregnancy, the states passed a wave of total bans on abortion. By the mid-20th century, these varied racial histories of the control of reproduction had merged under a single legal regime, and the Supreme Court decided Roe versus Wade. Roe came down during the early years of what we now call the second wave of feminism, and a backlash was already in the works. One of the most prominent features of that backlash was the focus on abortion, which emerged as an encapsulation of an entire range of beliefs about gender and the status of women. Just like in the 19th century, this was also a period of backlash against a Black civil rights movement and a period of white panic over the prospect of multiracial democracy. So the terms of the debate were a little different in the 20th century than in the 19th, but the basics were the same. So we often use the word politics to refer to electoral politics, meaning the campaigning, the horse race, and so on. So when we ask this question, how did everything get so political? What we often mean is, how did it get so partisan? Right? And that's what this is illustrating with the red and the blue and these very angry, unpleasant-looking people. It's about the partisanness of politics. And the follow-up question when we talk about politicians is, why can't they just work together to solve problems? That's what we sent them to the legislature to do. Why don't they do that? But the word politics simply refers to the exercise of power. Politics is the process of deciding how to wield the power of the state. Sometimes that means solving problems, and sometimes that works. A group of people have a common problem, they have different ideas about what to do, they have different interests. Politics is the process of hashing out those interests and those ideas and deciding what to do. When that happens, we don't complain, how did it get so political? Because we tend not to notice when politics are working. Nobody makes this complaint, at least. For example, the politicization of Black women's reproduction under slavery was a solution to a problem. We, the relevant we, had a problem. How are we going to run these plantations without importing more slaves? We got together and came up with a solution, a breeding program of unfathomable cruelty, but to which no one with much power really objected for a while. Eventually they did. Eventually it became partisan, and eventually it became a war. Environmental issues seem like an area where the problem-solving conception of politics ought to work better. We all want to drink clean water, we want to breathe clean, COVID-free air, and we would prefer that our children not have to live in the apocalypse that our capitalist system is currently preparing for them. Then why are we accelerating toward that apocalypse? If it were just a matter of figuring out the best way to stop the disruption of the climate, then ordinary politics might work, and no one would be complaining about how it got so political. Protecting the environment became political, meaning partisan and polarized, because it turns out that we're not all on the same side. There is a small group of people with a lot of power who are reaping immense wealth from the destruction of the earth, and there is a much larger group of us who are comfortable enough to be complicit. it is when that power and that comfort started to be seriously threatened that protection of the environment became political in this negative, partisan, polarized sense. Abortion similarly became political in the late 19th century and the late 20th century in reaction to the first and second waves of feminism, as well as to the two major Black civil rights movements in our nation's history. That is when entrenched power faced a serious threat, and forcing women to give birth or to die trying encapsulates a much broader worldview about gender roles, about hierarchy, and about exploitation. And so it is a vehicle for a certain kind of polarization. That is why the anti-abortion movement, the anti-gay and lesbian movement, and the anti-trans movement are all of a piece, and why racism runs through all of them. It is why today, around the country, pregnant women are being denied medical care, everything from routine prenatal checkups to emergency treatment when they're bleeding in the emergency room, because many of the states have decided that forcing women to bear children or die trying is more important than that suffering and the risks that are being imposed on those pregnant women. All of this politicization, as illustrated here, to me, in some ways, may actually be cause for optimism for what I see as the causes of justice. Gandhi said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win, meaning justice wins. If that's right, then when people are complaining, this is fighting, right? If he's correct, then this kind of complaint is a sign that we're in the fight you stage, and that might be so bad because then justice wins. Possibly. I am less optimistic than Gandhi. He was famously optimistic, so I guess that's not a surprise. But I do think that there's some important differences. His was a long-term strategy, and on issues like climate change, we have non-negotiable deadlines, and we've already blown past quite a few of them. So I don't think justice is going to win on that one or on a lot of other related issues in our society. I do nonetheless hope that it will, and I hope that you do too. Hope, unlike predictions or optimism, hope is not objective, and I don't think it's a feeling either. Hope is a practice, and as Rebecca Traister has written, it is a tactical necessity. We are morally obliged to behave as if there is reason for hope, even if objectively speaking, the chances are slim. Thanks. I'll just leave that there.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. It was a pleasure to have all of you share your presentations. And at this time, we're going to move into the Q&A. So I invite the panelists, Professor Montoya and Professor Spencer, to join us up here. And, well, I'm guessing that many of you had questions before you came tonight, and now you may have new questions or more questions or different questions. So the second part of the program, traditionally we engage the audience with a mix of, we'll ask you some kind of poll type questions. There'll be an open Q&A later. And in the middle, we're going to also have a couple of questions that we've prepared for our presenters. So we're going to get started with the first question. And for our virtual audience, you can feel free to share your remarks in the chat. And I've got this handy iPad so that I can hopefully get some of those shared with me. I already have a question. And the question to start with is, reflecting on what you've heard tonight, or maybe what you read in the Coloradan, what role has higher education played in preparing you to participate in the democratic process? So feel free to put your answers in the chat. For those of you here, we have Brennan with a microphone, and she can bring that to you. Oh yeah, I'll repeat the question, sure. How has your experience in higher education played a role in preparing you to participate in our democratic process? Yeah, right over here. And if you're not feeling like it's higher education directly, maybe there's something else that you feel has been really influential to how you participate in democracy.
I would say that higher education has helped me just ask questions and ask the right questions and be able to identify information as either biased, partisan, or just factual, and notice when certain politicians are using that information in a certain light to help their cause or their viewpoint, rather than actually just taking the information as it is.
Do you mind telling us your name?
I'm David.
David, thanks. Oh, so this is important for the audience online. It says the chat function's been disabled, but you can use the Q&A function to respond to the question and to ask your own questions. So, I don't know, maybe there was a malfunction with the chat. Anyone else? All right. Oh yeah, here we are. Down in the front, there's a commenter. I guess the cold cough.
Thanks. Monty Marshall. What I find most important about education in general is just learning a process by which we can identify alternatives to finding solutions to common problems that don't involve a coercive or a forceful response to try and force one side to agree to a solution that may benefit another side, that we find common solutions. And the only way to do that is through deliberation, research, common understandings, and discussion. And it's a long, involved process. Democracy doesn't work overnight. It works through months and months, because it takes a long time to share a lot of divergent views and come up with something that's satisficing or acceptable to those same divergent groups. The crucial aspect of democracy that I learned when I was in graduate school is that we all agree not to use coercion and violence to settle our differences. And that forces us, in a way, to come to common solutions, because there is no way to force a resolution.
Thank you. I see a hand over here, too.
So I say this with love as a faculty member in higher education, but higher education has some work to do. There's almost no institution in the country that's lost more trust in the last 10 years than higher education. We speak very partisanly and very piously about inequality as we've become more expensive, and as we arguably become more focused on the etiquette of the upper classes as opposed to the material concerns of the lower classes. We are, in many parts of the country, seen as so irrelevant in creating conversations across differences that there are people who are winning landslide campaigns in purple states running against us. That's a problem, regardless of where you sit. And so I hope that we'll take that, whatever package it comes in, I hope that we'll take that feedback that we're getting from the public and from the electorate very seriously and think critically about how we can do better.
Would you mind sharing your name and what you teach at CU?
I'm Matt Burgess, host of the Free Mind podcast.
Awesome. Awesome.
Assistant professor of environmental studies here at CU.
Great. Thank you for being here tonight. All right. Well, I think now, and I want the audience online to know I have some really great questions that we'll be asking, but I'm going to start with a couple that we have sort of prepped for the group. So just to get started and to hear a little bit more from all of you, are you seeing any trends right now that make you feel optimistic about the current, I'll say political partisan climate in this country? And you can just popcorn, speak up when you're ready.
For me, the most optimism I see is the increase in political engagement. Voter turnout, the 2020 election was the highest turnout in 100 years in terms of eligible voters, which is pretty incredible, because in 1908, when we had 65% of eligible voters voting, half the country wasn't even eligible. Mm-hmm. And then we increased the number of people who were eligible to vote, and that percentage of eligibility went up to 66 or 67%. I think one of the great things that Donald Trump has done for this country is activate a whole bunch of people who never were voting before. That was the whole big thing. Who are these people who were never voting before? Now they're watching the news and becoming engaged. And I think having more people participate and dialogue with each other, to me, is an optimistic kind of development in the country.
That's great.
I'd agree with that. I think that there are these moments of mobilization, which I think are really interesting. I think part of it, too, is seeing young people question both of the parties. I think that sort of accountability where they're not just automatically identifying with one or following those patterns, but really kind of a little bit of the what have you done for me lately? Kind of what is it what are you about? You say that you're for these things, but what does that look like in practice? How is that affecting my life, right? And I think that that's an important part of it, right? That this accountability if we go too much into tribalism, we're not really holding people accountable. We're kind of giving our loyalty right from the get-go. And I think that there is work to be done. I'm not kind of both citing it, but I think it's true. I think that there are a lot of cases where I can look at both parties within the state and see places where they're not representative of the populations that they're supposedly representing, that they're not doing the type of outreach and engagement that they should be doing. And I think that seeing people demand more from them is a really good step. It's a part of democracy at work, right? It's a part of saying, how can you actually deliver on solutions to these problems that are very real? Maybe we want more than the rhetoric of doing it and starting to kind of mobilize in different ways, right? If you're not going to come up with solutions, then we're going to come up with solutions. And I think that's to me, that's interesting, and it makes me hopeful. When I see students engaging in maybe not traditional ways, we look at some of those numbers sometimes of voter turnout and young people, those numbers are a little bit higher than they've been in the past. And they're really challenging the system, and I think that's an interesting development, and it makes me hopeful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, as everyone was probably can guess, I do optimism well on this question, but I do think that engagement, and in particular the disaffection from the parties, is a good sign. One thing we haven't mentioned when we talk about party polarization in the US is the phenomenon of asymmetric polarization, in which, in terms of policy positions, the Republican Party is running a race to the right and has the electoral strategy of appealing to the base while suppressing the rest of the vote, right, is the strategy. The Democratic Party is less polarized in terms of substantive, has moved less. The Democratic Party is the party of the status quo right now. And the unwillingness to be satisfied by the status quo, I think, is a good sign.
Great, thank you. I'm going to switch it up from what I thought I would ask, but after hearing all of you speak, I'd love to hear, if there was something you could do a deep dive on where you could take your research next, or maybe where it's already going. What is that? What's the topic you're investigating now? if there's, hopefully as it relates.
Just wrote a
to
book, so you should
Yeah,
talk.
let's hear
I'm going
about
to plug
it.
my
Let's hear
book.
about it.
No, so the deep dive for me is actually abortion is a small part actually of what I have been working on for a long time, which is questions of the law of pregnancy in general. And overall, I guess my deep dive is on the connections among different legal systems, different social movements, and the broad worldviews that they represent. So most of my work is actually about parental rights and motherhood in the pregnancies that go to term and result in babies and what happens then. And I actually think there are very deep connections between the legal and ideologies for how we define family and parenthood. There are deep connections to the struggle over abortion as well. And I could go on at length, but take a
You'll
look
be
at the
here
book
for the reception,
instead.
hopefully. You can maybe, if people want to talk more, we can talk in the reception, yeah.
You want to go?
Go for it.
So I'm working on a project on Latino and Latina, especially politics in Colorado. So it's a personal project for me. I'm from southern Colorado, and my family goes back several generations. And part of what's been interesting in studying gender and race is to kind of learn about groups that we don't often hear about. And so part of that, I'm doing a book that looks at the Latina legislators that have been elected since 1970, which is when they were first elected, and looking about their political journeys, and really listening and hearing about that, but then also finding the history. And so part of it's kind of related to this is that sometimes we have a tendency when we're looking at these dimensions of difference to flatten them out. And like Latinos as a population are really diverse and heterogeneous, and there's all sorts of political persuasions and identities. There are conservatives, there are progressives, and really hearing all of those stories and not flattening out the differences and looking why we might see different patterns of politics with them. Hearing why people, what in their journey became important to them and what shaped their lives and led them to engage in politics in different ways has been really good. Finding some of those unheard or untold stories, which, I know one of the questions later has to deal with, how do we move past this? I think sometimes just listening to each other. I feel like as a social scientist, one of my favorite parts of my jobs is to do interviews and to listen to people and learn all about them and learn about people who have totally different views than I do. And it's really fascinating to understand how they came to those positions, what in their life led them to understand things in very different ways. And so it's been an amazing project for me, but it's also been just one of those exercises in empathy and trying to understand, how people who might have similar backgrounds as me have gone in very different political directions. And so it's been a fun project, and it's one that I hope to do more of. So.
Can't wait to hear more about what you're learning.
Yeah.
Some of the work that I'm doing right now stems from what I was talking about before, which is exploring the incentive structures for political parties in a way that can create more, equitable efforts by parties to mobilize people, to engage with the electorate. And I think there's surprising little knowledge about that. So some of it is just exploring different structural setups, multi-member districts, ranked choice voting, all these things that you may have heard of. But we're so new in this realm in American politics, we actually don't know exactly how all of that would play out, and exploring how different kind of institutional arrangements might say something about the incentives that parties then have to win or to aggregate power. And then I'll plug Matt, since Matt already gave a talk. Matt Burgess was quoted in the Coloradan article that all of us were also interviewed for, and is studying partisan polarization directly head on through public opinion polls, focus groups, talking to people, and has a sense of what makes people tick when they become so tribal. And I think matching up that kind of understanding with the stuff that I'm doing, which is, I can think about institutional dynamics, but I don't know what's going to happen when you plug in people's preferences. I'd like to know more about that. The last thing I'll say is, if you read the opinions by judges about broken politics, The thing that you may find surprising is that no judge can articulate what the harm is. Like one of the reasons that the Supreme Court said we cannot do anything about partisan gerrymandering is they said, what is the harm that's accruing to you? Is that the political parties don't have enough balanced power? Is it that voters don't get to cast a ballot in a box? And they disagreed and they couldn't come up with it. And ultimately they said, we don't know what the harm is. What is the representational harm? And that's kind of shocking because you'd think it would just be a natural, we all know what the harm is, but if I pushed you on it, and I may outside, how would you describe exactly what's wrong with gerrymandering? It seems unfair. It's not equal. Equal compared to what? My vote's diluted compared to what? So part of my research is diving into some of those issues to articulate what these harms are that the status quo is inflicting on us in our current political situation.
I can't wait to talk. I want to talk to all of you with long coffees and conversations. There's my mic. So we do have some questions that have come in online. I want to start with those because try to keep it fair and balanced. Since they're not here physically, it might feel a little bit more challenging to participate. So I'm going to just start with question number 1 that says, what are your thoughts on how the media influences what the electorate believes, even to the extent where it impacts our democratic process? I can repeat that too, yeah? What are your thoughts on how the media influences what the electorate believes, even to the extent where it impacts our democratic process?
I have to say that that's something that's been weighing heavily on me. Sometimes people in my family might have the news running and different ones, and I have to say, the clear partisan bent, the reporting on the same events in completely different ways, and in ways that are sensationalized, right? That there's I can't listen to cable news networks anymore. They really like both sides. It just seems almost to make a joke of things. Like it's and the fact that news anchors then, when pressed on it, just say, well, it's just entertainment, right? Like that it's entertainment that's actually, there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of, I don't know, I guess it's even hard to articulate, just kind of feeling that there seems to be kind of this movement away from really trying to present things in, not that there's a non-biased way, because I don't think it's entirely possible to be non-biased in talking about some of these issues, but the effort in terms of being balanced, that there seems to be kind of this effort to kind of almost outdo each other in terms of some of the outrageous things that are being said. And so it's a little bit harder to sort through all the noise, right? And I think that's why kind of the importance of higher education, about teaching students, hopefully that sort of literacy of being able to look through and sort through and question rather than take things at face value is really important, but it's something that needs to be more accessible, that sort of literacy. So I don't know, I feel that it continues to get worse, and not necessarily that sort of accountability. And now we have all of these news sources, right? So now it's not just like what you get when you turn on the television or the radio, but the internet, right? And trying to sort through what is fact-based and critical is hard, right? It's hard to sort through all of that. And I think about that even sometimes as a professor, who researches to kind of get the information and verify the sources and get through it is harder than it used to be. And so that's really an issue that I think is going to continue to be, without any sort of regulation, that we're going to continue to have these misinformation campaigns that can run pretty effectively. I think is it dead now?
Oh, we're going to get some AV support and tech support and get Professor Montoya a new mic. But in the meantime,
yeah, I think the media has played a really big role in the partisan tribalization of things, where there's a loyalty to the red and blue rather than to issues that people people care about. Am I flicking? I'm flicking now too. So, I mean, in my own experience, the only, for me, truly disappointing thing in Donald Trump no longer being president was to see how many of the people who I thought cared about whether we drill in Alaska or the Gulf or whether we put immigrant children in cages on the border actually didn't care. They only cared to use it as a weapon against Trump. And as soon as he was gone and Joe Biden did the same things, it was crickets. And I think that's largely media driven.
Yeah, one thought that I was having is as we were getting ready for this event, I just got some news alerts on my phone and saw the settlement between Fox and Dominion. That's the most extreme example to me of the effect that media can have, which is to propagate falsehoods and, against corporations. And that case had such compelling evidence, it seemed like a potential vehicle to get a re-understanding about the limits of what media organizations can do when it comes to politics. And now it looks like we won't get that sense from our courts. They got a lot of money, it looks like. And so maybe that's the right way that this needed to happen. I saw a statement from Fox News that says, now we can all just move on. And I was thinking, I don't want to move on. I wanted there to be something that happened here. But that's the most extreme. And the other thought that I had is just the very first question you posed, which is, I don't know how to solve the media fracturing and the silos that people find themselves in. But I hope I'm not naive to think that I'm choosing a career to be in a higher education institution because I do think we're helping people navigate that space. It's a small percentage of people in the world who are in an institution of higher education. But I'm hopeful that that small percentage, at least, we're giving tools and resources to navigate this world so that they can be more responsible with the kinds of media content that they digest and then that they implement in their lives. As you were discussing, you're learning some of these tools. So I'm hopeful.
And maybe influential, right? You're talking about the small group, the small percentage, but maybe it's not just an individual impact, but the potential for people to have influence.
I hope.
We hope, yeah.
I wanted to just say, too, the role of social media in this, too, which we didn't necessarily bring up, which is, I remember this moment where on social media, there was something that you could do where you could see what Donald Trump was seeing on his feed. And I thought that was interesting, how it would be interesting to be able to shift your feed to different perspectives and not just focused on Trump, but what somebody who was on the right was seeing versus somebody whose algorithm on the left was seeing, and how they were such different realities, right? What news articles were popping up, what sort of things people were circulating, and just how you could say, to me it was okay, that gave me a little insight about why voters might be saying things or that in a different direction, because the information they were being fed was so radically different. It was almost like you were living in two different countries, and kind of maybe that's what's happening in terms of some of the distribution of information. And so, I don't know, and we're having this moment too about talking about that, social media is unregulated, and some of the things that we're seeing happening with Twitter and kind of challenging as things are being tweaked for that I think, technology is definitely getting ahead of us ethically in terms of what we need to consider for our democracy.
Thank you all for weighing in on that. I'm going to switch to the audience and see if, maybe we have a question here in the auditorium that someone would like to ask. Oh, yes. Microphone is on its way to you.
Oh, you want to hold it? Okay, my name is Steve Sargent. I have a question for Professor Spencer. You talked about the role of corporations in the political process. I'm wondering what effect the Citizens United ruling, which we all tend to think of as corporations are people, what effect that's had on corporations in the political sphere.
That's a great question, and I'm glad that you raised it. It's, when I teach Citizens United in my election law class, it's kind of interesting because as you build up the framework of campaign finance law in the United States, Citizens United occupies this very small corner in terms of what it was doing and what it was, what it represents. It's become the boogeyman for the left, essentially, with everything that's wrong in the United States as Citizens United. A couple of thoughts. So empirically, we have not seen the floodgates open of corporate spending in the United States directly on politics. For reasons that I think I was trying to allude to in my talk. There have been instances where corporations or their CEOs have gone out and supported a cause and received such backlash that they think that's not good for them. There's systematic studies that look at valuations of corporations, stock prices, people's investments, and they're lower for corporations that are very highly politically active. So it's what Citizens United did, I think, is more controversial for the legal frameworks and this idea perhaps that corporations get the same rights that individuals do, as though the language that Congress shall make no law abridging our free speech equally applies to an entity that's non-human as it does to a human, in ways that we don't think about other amendments to the Constitution. You can't unconstitutionally search and seize in the same way that you do on a human. So that's, I think, controversial. But in terms of the idea that Citizens United basically turned our country more into some kind of oligarchy than we already were, the people who are spending the most amount of money in American politics probably made their money through corporate wealth, but it's not the corporate structure that's giving that voice. It's the individual, it's the Sheldon Adelsons of the world, it's the George Soroses of the world, it's the Koch brothers of the world, who are more influential than any individual corporation.
Thank you. Well, we're here. Another question from the audience, perhaps? Okay, wonderful. And then we'll switch back to a question from our online community.
So in regards to social media, I don't think you need to see other people's feeds. I think all you have to do is turn on Fox News and CNN, and you will see a completely different story on both sides. My question would be, as professors at CU, do you share your political affiliations with your students? And if so, do you think you should? The reason I ask that is I have a daughter at college, and she has learned, growing up in Boulder, we're more conservative. She's learned to read the teacher and understand that with the comments that you make, how her responses should be. And so she's not free to speak her mind, and that's where I thought college was supposed to be, where you learn different sides. And I don't see that. I see a very politicized institution, CU, and I'd just be curious, as all of the professors, what percentage are liberal and what percentage are conservative? And I just think that that's one of our bigger problems. I think the media is the bigger problem, and our politicians are horrible people. But I would just say that we've got a lot of competing ways that people are learning, and they should be open to be able to communicate to you guys no matter what they believe, and not be fearful of being criticized, being called out, being abused by other students because of the way they feel. So I just wanted to see what you guys had to say about that.
Thanks for that question. I think it seems really relevant. I've taught myself at CU some adjunct classes, and I think it is a challenging thing to balance, knowing that there are a lot of viewpoints in the room. So I'd love to hear what you all want to share about that.
So as somebody who teaches political science and who often teaches classes on race and gender, I think there's always a lot of assumptions that students have when they come into the classroom. And so one of the things that's always been really important to me is to establish respect in the classroom right from the beginning, and set the stage that you can come in this classroom. It doesn't matter what your perspective is, you're not going to get a grade, your grade is not determined on what your political persuasion is. It is determined on your ability to think critically and to communicate that effectively. And I say that as if you're coming in here thinking that if you're progressive, you're automatically going to get an A for arguing something that's not well supported, that's not true. And if you think that you come in here and you're conservative and you argue something well and look at the information, that you're automatically going to get graded down. That's not true either. And so I don't necessarily say what my affiliation is, because I don't necessarily think, to me, that's a personal component to it. But I know that students draw a lot of assumptions because of the ways that the parties have polarized around issues of race and gender. Whereas before, I might have been able to claim a more moderate position. The fact that I'm talking about those issues in places where the Republican Party right now is actually outlawing them, right, has meant that, like, my position, even if it hasn't changed, how it fits in terms of partisan lineups has changed pretty dramatically. And so I think it's really kind of hard then, right? So I just kind of addressed that. We're talking about race and gender, and automatically that puts me on that ideological spectrum because I believe and study and can demonstrate the ways in which it's important politically. Now, that being said, we're going to question everything. We're going to be critical, and we're going to have to put together arguments with data and look at it and question. And so that's the way I try to approach it. And then I do talk a lot about respect. It's like we can disagree with each other, but we need to do it in respectful ways. And there are standards that we have as a university in terms of respecting people, and then also the recognition that sometimes playing devil's advocate can still have a really negative impact on people. And we talk a lot about intent versus impact, that your intent can be good and it can still have a negative impact. And we need to be thinking about both of those things, that the classroom is a place to learn. And so I don't expect anybody to feel comfortable. So it's not a safe space. And I talk a lot about we don't have safe spaces here because we're confronting really difficult things, but we have to recognize that it might have differential impact on groups. And so we're just really frank about it. I think that we need to be able to have these really difficult conversations. We can do it in a way that's respectful, but we do need to work on what it means to be respectful of people's life experiences and their lived realities. And so yeah, no, I feel like that sort of labor is a lot of what I do, and it might be a lot more labor than other classes that aren't addressing issues that are quite so loaded have to do. And so I do sometimes have to, do some self-care. Then when we go through, it can be exhausting at the end of the day. It's exhausting to kind of talk about these issues in this setting when you know that it might bring up those sort of affective or emotional responses with people. So.
Thank you.
Please do. You're hitting on a really core problem in U.S. universities. I think this is what was referred to earlier. One of the reasons I think universities are losing trust in the general public is there a sense, based on research, that a lot of higher education faculty are more liberal. They've given to Democratic candidates, I guess, is probably the proxy that's being used in a lot of cases, which is a good proxy, but it's not the best proxy. And I also think that some of the kind of loss of trust and the stereotypes of universities is a little unfair. I don't think it's totally unfair, and it's something that we have to confront. Getting more ideological and viewpoint diversity in our campuses is a mission that CU shares and is working on, sometimes flawed, sometimes good. But the reason I think it's unfair is our job is to teach our students, and we may have blind spots, and there's a couple of approaches I can say, look, this is my politics. So as I say these things, now you can share this. But also, the classroom, I'm not going to divulge my politics. We're going to talk about these issues, and you're going to have a diversity of experiences. You may have a professor who says, look, I'm a liberal, unabashed, and we're going to talk about these issues and bash on the conservative idea. And you say, I'm the counter voice at this university, and I'm going to do the conservatives. You have other people who say, you'll never be able to tell. And by the time you've gone through 120 credits, hopefully you've had enough of experience in different settings that you do feel comfortable in that learning environment. And then the other thing I'd say that's unfortunate, kind of cheating for Professor Hendricks and me, is we're at a law school. So our job, if you've ever been involved in any kind of lawsuit, you may be annoyed because your lawyer's representing you and the other lawyer's representing the person that you can't stand. And you go and argue, and then at the end of the day, you go home and the lawyers go get drinks. We're all friends. And we learn the whole point of teaching lawyers how to be lawyers is I don't care what you think. One is you're a hired gun on some level. And two, you're only effective if you can articulate the other side's position. Not crash the other side's perspective? Can you articulate it? And so that gives us a luxury, I think, to have a classroom dynamic that is open, I think, more for students. My own personal sense is when I editorialize in class, we'll talk about an opinion, and I'll say, look, this is my personal opinion. I'm not convinced by that argument. I think it's a weak legal argument. But you need to know this is what it's being said. And I hope that transparency at least lets students know that I can trust them to say the same thing. But it's a learning experience. I'm relatively new to this, and I definitely think, I feel sad that your daughter feels unconstrained to say exactly what she thinks. And I would sense that that the pressure is probably more from fellow students than faculty members. But at the same time, it's our job to create that culture. And the more that you make this common wherever you go is good feedback for our university to try to fix this. It's a real thing. We can't pretend it away. And so I appreciate you raising it for sure.
Yeah, I had the same response. I teach law students. Having their views torn apart is part of what they're supposed to go through. So a couple of things. One, in sort of direct answer to your question, again, sort of similar to Celeste, because of the subjects that I teach, it seems to me dishonest to hide my views on the issues from the students and pretend that I'm neutral. And frankly, that's on everything from abortion to my most impassioned rants in class have to do with procedural due process, actually. So very dry legal topics that it's very important professionally that my students learn to care about. I don't talk about abortion, for example, in class the way I did tonight. I focus more on the legal arguments, on improving people's arguments. There is a problem, I think, using party affiliation as a measure of the politics in universities has some validity, but can be flawed, especially with the issue of asymmetric polarization and issues on which, I would be concerned if a large portion of our physics department did not think climate change was a serious problem, because that's reality. But I do find, for example, I worry about students who won't argue with me, because I'm teaching lawyers, and they need to learn to do that. And I also worry, I encounter a great deal of intellectual laziness on the part of left-leaning students who need to have it explained to them that a majority of current federal judges do not share their views on a great deal of issues, right? So if you want to just tell me the Supreme Court is wrong, I probably agree with you. But I'm a professor, and they're the Supreme Court, and they create the world that you have to operate in. So I do see a lot of it coming from fellow students in a disciplinary kind of class, so that I spend a lot more time in class articulating, for example, all the reasons gay and lesbian people shouldn't be allowed to get married, because my students are willing to do it, even by saying, the state argued that, right? So I do think it's a problem that's a barrier to learning for many students of different political views.
I do want to add, though, that sometimes CU's reputation as being a really progressive campus is a little is a little exaggerated in terms of it. That I think there is a lot more intellectual diversity among the faculty, the administration, and the students. And I definitely still have students who talk about some of the intolerance that they experience that is not from a social justice perspective. And so I think that there still is a lot of sexism and racism and intolerance that are on these campuses that we we sometimes need to kind of question a little bit sometimes the narrative that's there. I grew up in Colorado Springs, right? So my family has a lot to say about like, well, what is it like in the People's Republic of Boulder? And I'm like, it might be a lot different than you actually expect. Just like people's perception of the Springs sometimes is accurate, but is also different because it's a diverse population and it's changing all the time. And I think that it's that flattening out, right? That there's this flattening out, that it's easier to tell a single story and a single narrative. And I think it's really important for us to question that and to hear all the stories. And the more stories we hear, the more like we realize like the human condition, right? That there's a lot of struggle. So, I think for me, one of the most important things to remember is to meet students where they are. Right, I'm always kind of telling. I direct a program that's for first-gen students, and often students that are from historically marginalized groups. And I'm like, we always need to meet people where they are, and just not leave them there, right? And that's the point of education, is to meet them where they are. And in order to educate them or to teach them, we need to figure out where they are. And then push them, right? And just like we're continually pushing ourselves, right? I always tell my students, I often will learn as much in a semester as you do if I'm doing my job right, because you're pushing me to think about things different, and you're bringing different experiences that might change the way that I think about things. And so education is not a one-way street where we're standing on the pulpit and delivering it. If we're engaging with the students, we're learning from them as well. And so creating a climate where they can actually communicate with us respectfully, then education is working the way that it should.
And I'll add one thing, is I think that the lack of kind of viewpoint diversity maybe, I don't know how much that really gets into classroom discussions. We're teaching like the classics. We're teaching a Supreme Court opinion. Like these are just things that we have to teach our students. What I do think is it leads to blind spots in other areas, the kinds of voices we bring to campus to talk to our students outside of the classroom, the kinds of policies we set for hiring. Those without that diversity, I think we see implications around the campus that we need to confront. But I would push back slightly just in terms of its actual impact in the classroom. I think by and large, not 100%, that experience, it's a cultivated professor talking about a topic in a particular way to get you to read these things that we need you to know. But we just elicited like the most animated discussion. So this is obviously, you're hitting a spot.
Yeah.
So we know this, and it's really great. So thank you.
So with that, I do have to wrap up the event, and I see there's some questions in the audience. We started a few minutes late, but we used to have this event as an hour, and the conversations are so rich, we moved to an hour and a half. I feel like we could go to 2, but we want to respect everyone's time. I'm sure I had some really great questions that were shared in the chat, and so if you want to reach out to us as organizers, or maybe there's a way for us to help you connect with the faculty members here to kind of have a conversation or ask a specific question, I think we can help support that. And for those of you who are here, we hope you stay and enjoy the reception, talk with folks, have conversations with faculty, with fellows who are here. And for those of you who are online, we have a number of resources. I think they're coming up on the slides. We have QR codes at the event on little table tents. We have it here. You should be able to get it from home, and it will be emailed to you. So you'll see a list of ways to, I think it's learn, engage, and give. So dive deeper into these topics with recommendations from our faculty here. And we're going to email out a full transcript of the event, as well as shortened videos of each talk. So if you really want to re-listen to what somebody shared tonight, you're going to have all of that in your email box within a couple days. So thank you all so much. Thank you to our wonderful faculty for being here. It was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you, and really I want to just express my gratitude and honor that you took time to participate in this tonight, and have a wonderful evening. And hopefully we'll see you in the fall. Take care.